Hi everyone, and welcome to our SCMR Talking Heads series. And the idea behind this series is to ask authors to tell us about their motivations for writing a piece of work. We wanted them to talk us through in a kind of agenda setting way about what motivated them to pick up a particular question. What's the added value, why they're doing what they do, and basically what it adds to our knowledge in the field of migration and ethnic relations. We wanted to do something a little bit different than there's a lot of talks in our COVID world that are going around and available. What we wanted to do is get authors to talk about their work that's also alongside the article that you can refer to. So it gives them a chance to talk a little bit more freely about what their aims and objectives in relation to doing this. So the articles, the abstracts and the links will be posted alongside the article. Now, although we've called it Talking Heads, we don't actually have David Byrne with us, but we have his imaginative equivalent in the migration and ethnic relations field today. We have Adrian Favell, who will be very familiar to many of you, I'm sure. Adrian, I think it's fair to say, is one of the most foremost theorists in migration in the world. At least I would say that, and that's how a colleague referred to him recently to me. And his career in many ways has been dedicated to unpacking this tricky word integration and policies in many different ways over many different years. And, to try and unpack how this works both in society as a policy framework, also whether our intellectual and academic models are sufficient to address these kind of issues. You can trace this through Adrian's biographical career as well. Philosophers of Integration, which came out in 1998 and was his original thesis work. Comparing France and the UK, and still has resonance today, which says something about it. And then 2008, Eurostars and Eurocities, he started talking about all these mobile people moving around between cities and free movement within Europe and what their lives looked like and what integration, if you like, meant for them. And then in Immigration, Integration and Mobility, 2015, he collected this body of work together. But I think it's probably fair to say that Adrian is now, sitting back and reassessing and wondering, with integration, as the title says, integration into what, and starting to challenge with the perspectives that are resonant today, such as post-colonialism, that kind of thing, what these integration, assimilation approaches, what they substantively mean, both for academia and policy today. So, yes, he's had a few critiques. That he's critiqued the work of Richard Alber, for example, and I'm sure you will now be hearing from Adrian himself what he has to say. So I'd like to pass over to Adrian Favell. Thank you from me. Bingo.
Hello. Well, thank you, Paul. Very pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk about why we should study integration and talk a bit about what motivates this and how it fits into the literature. And then I'll go through three key points about integration as I see it. So first of all, I think what we can do is go back to Rogers Brubaker, 2001, his famous article, The Return of Assimilation, where he identifies that diversification had reached a kind of peak in advanced liberal democracies at that time, in the late 1990s. That there's a kind of re-emphasis going on with citizenship, membership, and nation building, and also scholars were re-emphasizing ideas about assimilation, coming from Albaranese work, for example, but also I think reflected in work in France and Germany on integration. And this kind of happened at the same time as there was recognized an eclipse of multiculturalism. David Cameron, Angela Merkel saying that multiculturalism was exhausted. This was endorsed by scholars like Christian Jotka, and it went hand in hand with the ascendancy and re-emergence of integration as the dominant way of talking about progressive transformations in society after immigration. So policymakers, politicians, journalists, but also scholars and students all wanting to talk about integration as the kind of reasonable mainstream view of what should be happening after immigration. And scholars at this time started to try to model it as in a middle way. It's not assimilation, not multiculturalism, but integration. Integration is somehow the opposite of segregation. It becomes a kind of dominant mainstream idea. Now, this, as I wrote about it in my PhD and first book, Philosophies of Integration, this has kind of two sources. One is ideas about integration that came from the US and civil rights were adopted in Britain as a way of talking about the emergence of a post-colonial society, multiculturalism in one nation, or multicultural nationalism, as Tariq Madood and others still talk about it. And the other source really is 1980s France, where there's a new reflection developing in France about Republican ideas of integration as a kind of civic philosophy, a universalist idea of citizenship. And this gets adopted across all of Europe, I think, as a result of this kind of shift in emphasis back towards national citizenship. And ironically, even gets imported back into Britain under New Labour, where there's a rejection of multiculturalism and a kind of neo-nationalism about integration as the key policy idea. I wrote about this at the time in an article called Policy Integration, Research and Integration Policy, that kind of talks about the reascendance of integration nations. And even the North Americans start to use the term integration instead of assimilation. So Alba and Fona's book, Strangers No More, there's a sort of slide from assimilation to integration, which for them means more or less the same kind of thing. Now, around 2015, I started sort of feeling that people are still not quite getting what it was I wanted to say, and I reformulate. I do an update of the essay from my book, Immigration, Integration, and Mobility. And in this, I'm sort of stressing that integration in its practical operation, as it's used by research, is not really any different to assimilation. The way Alba and Nee uses it is not much different to the way Anthony Heath uses integration, Alba and Nee assimilation, or integration in German research, for example, like Kelter and Kogan's type of the work, the sort of dominant quantitative work. And yet integration, using the term integration in some sense, is worse than using the word assimilation in this context, because it's explicitly nationalist, it's explicitly about nation building, and it still reproduces all of the methodological nationalism that's inherent in these linear kind of standard models of immigration to citizenship. There's also going on from about this time a new wave of critical migration studies on integration, such as Willem Schinkel's Imagining Societies, and a whole wave of other authors associated with more critical positions in immigration studies who are questioning the term of integration, associating it with the racialization of minorities, or showing, still wanting to talk about things like superdiversity or conviviality as alternatives. The quantitative scholars are piling in, they're coming up with integration models that have not really thought through the conceptualization of immigration and integration, as I think should have been the case. And also the new wave of refugee studies leads to a new wave of integration model building. So I felt I had to restate my case. 12 propositions, as are explained in the article that this talk's connected to. And here I want to restate them as 3 key points. Okay, and the key points I want to talk about are points about integration into what? This mysterious thing. What is it that immigrants, the so-called immigrants that we're talking about in the transformation of society, what are they integrating into? And the first thing I want to say is that integration in immigration studies, integration into what? Integration always produces natives and outsiders, invisible majorities and identifiable minorities. Now, the focus on integration, of course, is about talking about identifying foreigners, minorities, kinds of difference that are in society, and wondering about how they're going to be absorbed into a native pre-existing society. It presupposes somehow that they will integrate successfully, perhaps become equal or the same as or similar to existing members of that society. Also, that society is going to be reunified as a cohesive whole. Now, obviously, we talk about this in a cultural terms. It sounds like assimilation in the bad old sense of the terms, but it is possible to talk about integration structurally, and scholars such as Alba and Fona will study integration, therefore, in terms of different sectors of society: the labour market, socioeconomic attainment measured by income, educational attainment, housing as a way of measuring integration, political participation as a way of integration. It may even be possible to think about shifting the unit. You know, we could talk about integration at the city level, integration into becoming a Londoner, for example. And we now have data sets as well that allow us to do comparisons across nations, how to compare different sorts of groups and their integration process in different kinds of national contexts. So what's the problem here? Now, what I want to argue is that whatever unit we take, whether it's the national unit, a sector of society or the economy, or even a subnational unit, we're going to have to set up categories in order to measure what is going on. Now, a lot of scholars who have made critical points about integration would point to the first point, that is that this obviously sets up categories that identify minorities or newcomers, say as immigrants, in terms that associate their racial or cultural identity or their foreignness as nationals with something that is apparently deficient in relation to the mainstream that they're integrating into. It tends to, differentiation in this case, tends to reproduce differences. And this is a sort of minoritization or migranticization that takes place. But I think there's also a bigger problem here, in a sense, that has had less attention, and that is in order to have something against which we can benchmark these groups that are supposedly integrating into the mainstream society, we have to construct a majority population. And this majority population in integration research is always constructed as a kind of mysterious, typical or normal national population that we can't really examine as such, because it's just a block of the majority against which we measure the integration of all of these different minority groups. The French talk about this as the Français de souche. You know, we leave aside the first, second, third, fourth generation of immigrant origin people, and the people who are left are the kind of real French, the French of French origin, with whom we're comparing the newcomers. In Britain, the British context, it's even worse in a sense. The majority population, typically statistically, is identified as a white British population. So the native population, the natives that we're measuring the newcomers against, is typically a white British population. And this creates a majority white population that is a kind of black box of whiteness. It's the whiteness that immigrants have to kind of become like, but it's a homogeneous white blocks. There's no conflict in it, it's not stratified. There's a kind of pre-existing harmony that's somehow been disrupted by the newcomers arriving in this society. They are a problem. There's a problem of integration, and the integration models then have to identify them as a problem that needs resolving in some sense. These integration models obviously tend to then identify the immigrants or newcomers with anybody that's not in the majority category. So, and we have a huge problem in Britain, as we know, with Black British Empire citizens being identified as immigrants because they're racially different because of these sorts of models, and then that leading to things like the Windrush situation. But also there's a kind of tendency to think that that at some point in the past, there were no immigrants there, and the immigrants have arrived, and now we have to talk about integrating those immigrants, i.e. that, you know, before 1945, there were no immigrants in British society, or that Britain was not an immigrant society all along. I hope that point is clear. So the second point, integration into what, is a kind of paradox. And it's a paradox of modernization. It's something to do with modernization. Those who are most integrated are in fact the least subject to integration. What I mean by this is that people who belong, who most obviously belong in our society, are the ones who least have to prove it, and they can do whatever they want and they're still integrated, whereas others have to keep proving it. So when we ask immigrants to integrate, we want them to disappear into the mainstream somehow. We want them to become part of the national population, become part of us, like us, part of us, or become part of the us. And of course, immigrants then, in order to become part of the us, always have to continually prove it. They have to sit integration tests that ask them a lot of questions that maybe normal nationals are not able to answer. I failed it last time I tried one of these tests. They're always asked to prove that they're good and the right kind of newcomer, that they're leaving behind differences that don't fit, that the different parts of their culture and religion that don't really work in this context have to be left out, or that they have to leave out attachments that are not about the here and now in this society and being part of this sort of society. And yet, if we ask who are the more successful people in our society, who might be the targets for these immigrants to integrate against if they have, followed the British stream towards integration, who are, in a Durkheimian sense, the most integrated people in our societies? Well, in a modern globalized society, the most integrated people are, in fact, the free-moving, mobile, global elites, in some sense. The free modern individual citizen who's able to do whatever they want in a modern society is the most integrated kind of person. They can go wherever they want, they can do whatever they want to do. They belong here, but they also belong everywhere else. And that's kind of what we should aspire to. This is really just, this is built into all models of modernization and development. Globalization as individualization is about denationalizing individuals. It's about individuals who become progressively freer of a kind of national determination. And yet this is the exact opposite of the nationalization that is imposed on immigrants, newcomers, and minorities in our societies. And there's two points that arise from this that I think are important. One is that the idea of integration that's being stated here for immigrants is a kind of threshold integration. It's only integration into the lowest segments of our society. It's not about integration into the elites or integration into the higher echelons. And this may indeed be racist or prejudiced in its kind of assumptions. Secondly, there's a kind of symbolic integration going on here, that the integration that's being imposed upon these newcomers or minorities is functional to the national project. It is in fact how nation building is continued at a point where lots of other nationals at other elite levels of society are free to come and go as they please, who have a kind of a la carte relation with our society. So it's a symbolic imposition of integration as nation building on the newcomers that's not applicable to other members of the same society. And I think something similar is going on with a lot of the debates around the so-called white English working class, for example, at the moment. They're being seen as the epitome of the integrated, true national population, and yet they're the people in the least advantaged positions in our societies, and they're subject to these kinds of pressures. In other words, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, they can talk about integration tests or imposing the national curricula on everybody, but they're completely free to go off and swan off to Germany and watch Wagnerian opera and be global individuals, because everybody else is proving what a good national is. Or Nigel Farage, who can talk about English nationalism, but then immediately go and collect his German citizenship and become an EU national. Integration is about having your cake and eating it, in other words, and it is at the heart of a stratified neoliberal kind of social order in which class, race, and nationality are used to maintain a stratified kind of order. So that's my second point. And my third point is that successful national integration produces global disintegration and increases global inequality. So let's just assume for a minute that we do have successful integration going on, that there are some immigrants who've kind of been so successful that they can live the British dream and become this kind of image of the successfully integrated individual in British society. We have our Rishi Sunak, or we have Sajid Javid, born in Rochdale who becomes Chancellor. We have our successful Black, Asian or Chinese or whatever athletes or rock stars who've been integrated. There should be surely nothing wrong with the picture of a Syrian family brandishing its British passports under a picture of the Queen to celebrate integrating into British citizenship, or British celebrations at the Olympics that are celebrating multicultural nationalism as a vision of the British future. My point here is that these kind of celebrations of British citizenship are branding integration as British, and the branding process that goes on here is how Britain attempts to differentiate itself from the world. That is, so as Britain integrates its immigrants and its minorities, it is trying to disembed itself or disintegrate itself from the rest of the world. It's trying to differentiate itself from the rest of the world. Putting value on a British citizenship is about putting value on a British passport, which means those who successfully become British get special access to political membership of our club and special rights and privileges that others will not get. In other words, in order to valorize becoming a British citizen, you have to devalorize the citizenship of others. All those who don't get to integrate in this way, all of those who couldn't get to Britain in the first place, all of those who've not been selected for this particular golden path, or those perhaps who've got the wrong nationality, the wrong ethnicity, or the wrong racial origin to begin with in terms of this kind of model. And what I'm indicating here is a familiar problem. It's the problem of the birthright lottery, the fact that global inequalities are indexed by nationality itself. That is, that the value of citizenship, the value of passport is an index of inequality, and integration is the way in which that index is maintained at a national level in terms of access to British citizenship. I mean, to counteract this, of course, we'd want to find ways in which the national citizenship gets devalued in relation to others. That is, other citizenships start to become more like British citizenship. So we want to look at the rights of non-nationals on one territory, or we might want to look at whether it's possible for somebody to to be able to live in a country without having to integrate like a national, or whether they are able to take the benefits and effects of living in this country, but take those benefits elsewhere to make those benefits leave the country so that they can benefit the people who've been left behind, the people who are unequal because they have no access to British membership. So in other words, integration for the few is exclusion for the many. And I think this key question needs to continue to be asked in terms of issues of migration and development, issues of transnationalism, about how we measure the continued existence of post-national rights, and the necessary fact within a globally integrated world that people have the ability to do things transnationally that is not connected to their national membership in some sort of way. So that's kind of the points that I want to make. You can kind of trace them in the books that I've written, and I'm, as Paul mentioned, I'm working on a new book for polity that will be called Integration After Diversity, where I want to develop, restate this argument, and behind this hopefully work towards developing a comprehensive political demography, which is what I think of as explaining the power structures, the national power structures that rest on our particularly false conceptions of immigration, integration, and citizenship. And I do think that these structures are ascendant in our world. They have been for the last couple of decades, and they're probably getting worse now with COVID. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Adrian. Some very interesting, provocative thoughts, and thank you for sharing them. And I'm sure that the debate will continue. Just to say that Adrian is going to formulate some of these ideas as the keynote for the JEMS SCMR conference that we hope to hold in spring and not virtually, so that I won't be in my lovely living room. So watch out for that when it's out and about. So thanks once more to Adrian, and it's goodbye from me, Paul Statham, Director of the SCMR, and see you next time on SCMR JEMS Talking Heads. Thank you.